There is a house in Basildon that the British state has now paid for twice. It was built with public money in the 1950s, one of hundreds of thousands put up in a decade when Britain was constructing council homes faster than at any point before or since. For 30 years, it was let to a family at a rent that covered its maintenance and slowly repaid its construction cost. It was, in accounting terms, an asset that produced income. In 1982, it was sold to its tenants for a little under half its market value. That was legal, deliberate, and enormously popular. Today, that house is owned by a private landlord. Here! It is let to a family who cannot afford the rent from their own income. So a substantial part of that rent is paid by the state in housing benefit every month. The building has not changed. The family in it are much the same sort of family. What has changed is that the state used to receive money for that house and now it pays money for it. Multiply that by roughly 2 million homes. This is the story of right to buy, and it is usually told as a political argument, a triumph of ownership, or a betrayal of social housing, depending on who is talking. Both versions skip the part that actually determines the outcome, because the policy was not, in the end, about selling houses. Almost every country sells public assets sometimes. What made this different was a single clause about what councils were allowed to do with the money. Start with why Britain had 5 million council houses in the first place, because it is not obvious and it was not inevitable. At the end of the First World War, Britain's housing stock was a scandal. Roughly 80% of homes were privately rented, much of it slum property owned by small landlords, and the returning army had been promised something better. The Housing Act of 1909, the Addison Act, committed central government to subsidizing council-built homes for the first time. The building continued through the 20s and 30s, but the transformative period came after the Second World War. Bomb damage had destroyed or made uninhabitable something like 4 million homes. The response was construction on a scale Britain has never repeated. Between 1945 and 1980, local authorities built over 4 million dwellings. In peak years, 1953-1967, councils alone completed more than 200,000 homes annually. To put that in context, total house building in Britain across all sectors in recent years has struggled to reach that figure, in a country with 12 million more people. By 1979, roughly a third of British households lived in a council home. It was not residual housing for the poorest, it was mainstream. Skilled workers, nurses, bus drivers, police officers lived in council houses, and many of them had waited years to get one. That is the stock that was about to be sold. Now the policy itself, and it is worth being precise because the detail is where the money is. The Housing Act 1980 gave secure council tenants of 3 years standing the legal right to buy the home they lived in. The council could not refuse. That word, right, was the innovation. Councils had been permitted to sell homes to tenants since the 1930s, and some had. What the 1980 Act did was remove the local authority's discretion entirely. And it attached a discount. A tenant of 3 years received a 33% discount on the market value. That rose by 1% for each additional year of tenancy to a maximum of 50%. In 1984, the maximum was raised to 60% for houses. In 1986, it went to 70% for flats. There were cash caps, varied over time and by region, but the principle held: a long-standing tenant could buy a house for less than half what it was worth. Take that in as an arithmetic fact rather than a political one. A discount of 50% on a public asset is not a sale. Half of it is a sale. The other half is a gift made by the state to whichever individual happened to be the sitting tenant on the day the law changed. Whether that gift was justified is an argument. That it was a transfer of public wealth to private hands is not an argument, it is a description. And it was overwhelmingly popular, which is the part that critics of the policy consistently underrate. Consider the position of a tenant in 1980. You had lived in the same house for 15 years. You had maintained it, decorated it, brought up children in it. You had paid rent for a decade and a half and owned nothing at the end of it. Your neighbors in identical houses were in the same position. And you were now offered the chance to own that house outright for perhaps 40% of its value, with a mortgage that in many cases cost less per month than the rent. Around 1.5 million households took that offer in the first 15 years. By 2023, the cumulative total across Britain was approaching 2 million. Any account of this policy that cannot explain why people said yes is not describing the world. They said yes because it was, for them, individually, an extraordinarily good deal. The question the policy raises is not whether the buyers were foolish. It is what happened to everyone who came after them. Which brings us to the clause that decides the whole story. When a council sold a house, the money did not stay with the council to spend as it wished. The Treasury required that a large proportion of capital receipts be used to repay debt, not to build replacement homes. The exact proportion moved around across 4 decades of rule changes. At points, councils were permitted to retain a quarter of receipts, at others considerably less, and for long stretches the restrictions were tightened rather than loosened. The effect was consistent. Councils were selling an asset and were substantially prevented from using the proceeds to replace it. Understand what that does. If a council sells a house for £60,000 and is allowed to spend that on building another house, the stock stays constant and the tenant gets ownership. Nobody loses. The policy is close to costless in housing terms. If the council sells the house and must hand most of the money to the Treasury to retire debt, the stock falls by 1 permanently, and there is 1 fewer home available to the next family on the waiting list. The right to buy did not, by itself, reduce Britain's social housing. The restriction on replacement did. Those are separate decisions taken by separate parts of government, and they are almost always discussed as though they were one thing. The numbers follow inevitably. In 1979, local authorities in England owned roughly 5 million dwellings. By 2023, that figure was around 1.5 million, with a further 2.5 million or so held by housing associations. Many of them transferred wholesale from councils in the 1990s and 2000s. Social housing as a share of all households fell from about 31% in 1979 to around 16% today. Roughly half the sector proportionally disappeared. Replacement never came close. In the decade to 2022, England sold tens of thousands of homes under right to buy and built a small fraction of that number to replace them. In some years, the replacement rate was below 1 in 4. The policy of 1-for-1 replacement, announced in 2012, was not met in any year of its operation. Meanwhile, the demand did not go anywhere. This is the point that gets lost. Selling a council house does not reduce the number of households in Britain who need somewhere affordable to live. It changes where they live and who they pay. A family who would have been housed by a council in 1985 is housed in 2025 by a private landlord. That family is frequently on a low income. The rent is frequently higher than a council rent for a comparable property. Private rents in England run substantially above social rents, often close to double. And the gap between what the family can pay and what the landlord charges is filled by the state. The instrument is housing benefit, now largely delivered through Universal Credit's housing element. Britain spends something in the order of £30 billion a year supporting people's rent. A large and growing share of that goes to private landlords. So follow the money through the whole cycle, because this is the mechanism the political argument obscures. Before, the state owns a house. It receives rent. The rent covers maintenance and debt service. The house appears on the public balance sheet as an asset producing income. The sale, the state receives a one-off payment of perhaps half the market value and is largely required to use it to pay down debt rather than rebuild. After, the house is in private hands. The state no longer receives rent. If the house is let to a low-income tenant, and a great many ex-council homes are, the state pays part of that rent every month indefinitely. The state has converted a recurring income into a one-off receipt and simultaneously created the recurring expense. Over a long enough period, the expense exceeds the receipt. There is no year in which this reverses. That is the shape of the thing. It is not an argument about whether ownership is good. The scale of the transfer into private landlord hands is larger than most people assume, and it is one of the better documented findings in British housing research. Multiple studies over the past decade have found that a substantial proportion of homes sold under right to buy are now in the private rented sector, in some local authority areas approaching or exceeding 40%. Nationally, the figure most often cited sits around 40% of sold stock. Freedom of information work by journalists and by the Chartered Institute of Housing has repeatedly turned up the same pattern, including cases of councils renting back their own former properties from private landlords at commercial rates to house homeless families. That last detail is worth stating slowly. There are documented instances of a local authority paying a private landlord to accommodate a family in a house that the same local authority built, owned, and sold at a discount. None of that was the intention. It is simply what a discount plus a resale market produces over 40 years. The original buyer or their children eventually sells at full market value. The buyer of that sale is frequently an investor, because an ex-council house in a decent area is a reliable yield. Nothing prevents it, and nothing was designed to. It is worth knowing where the idea came from, because it was not invented in 1980 and it was not, originally, a partisan one. Councils had been able to sell homes to tenants since the interwar period, and a number did. Birmingham ran sales in the 1960s. Conservative-controlled authorities in the 1960s and 1970s sold with enthusiasm. Some Labour ones sold quietly. Peter Walker, as Environment Secretary in the early 1970s, actively encouraged it. The Labour government of 1974 to 1979 did not abolish the practice, it simply declined to compel it, leaving the decision with each authority. What changed in 1980 was compulsion and scale. Michael Heseltine, who took the policy through Parliament, understood precisely what he was doing politically. He was offering a large, identifiable group of people a substantial capital asset, and doing it in a way that no future government could easily reverse, because reversing it would mean taking property from families who had bought it in good faith. He was right about that. Every subsequent government of every colour retained the policy in England for over 40 years. The Labour administrations from 1997 to 2010 reduced the maximum discounts and tightened some rules, but did not repeal the right. A policy that hands 2 million households an asset is not a policy anyone can undo. That is worth separating from the merits. Whatever else Right to Buy was, it was an exceptionally well-designed piece of political engineering, and the reason it survived is that it created its own constituency on the day it passed. Now follow a single house through the whole 40 years, because the aggregate figures conceal what actually happens. Take a 3-bedroom semi built by a district council in 1954 for around £1,500, funded by borrowing repaid over 60 years. Through the 1960s and 1970s, it is let at a rent that covers management, maintenance, and the debt service, with a small surplus going to the housing revenue account. In 1984, the tenants, there since 1969, so 15 years of tenancy, buy it. Market value, say £24,000. Their discount at 15 years is 50%. They pay £12,000. The council receives £12,000 and is required to apply most of it to debt. The family live there for 25 years. In 2009, they sell for, say, £160,000. That gain is theirs. Entirely legitimately, they took the risk and paid the mortgage. The buyer in 2009 is a landlord who has noticed that ex-council stock in that town yields well. He lets it at the local market rent. The tenants are a family on a low income, and roughly half their rent is met by housing benefit. Run the state's ledger. It received £12,000 once in 1984. It has since paid, at a conservative several £1,000s a year of benefit toward that property's rent, a cumulative sum that passed the original receipt within about 3 years and has kept running for over a decade. And it no longer owns the house. There is no villain in that sequence. The tenants did nothing wrong. The landlord did nothing wrong. The council followed the law. The outcome is produced entirely by the rules, which is what makes it a mechanism rather than a scandal. There is also a second route by which councils lost stock, and it is far less discussed than Right to Buy, despite moving comparable numbers. From the late 1980s and accelerating sharply after 1997, councils were encouraged to transfer their entire housing stock to newly created housing associations. This was called large-scale voluntary transfer. Tenants voted on it. The inducement was blunt. Central government would write off the council's housing debt on transfer, and the receiving association could borrow privately against the stock to fund repairs that the council was not permitted to fund itself. For an authority with aging homes, a maintenance backlog, and a legal ceiling on what it could borrow, the arithmetic was close to irresistible. Around 3 million homes moved this way. Housing associations are not private landlords. They are non-profit social landlords, and the homes remain social housing. But the transfers changed who controlled the stock. moved it outside direct democratic accountability, and because associations charge affordable rents set as a proportion of market rents rather than traditional social rents, contributed to the long rise in what social housing costs its tenants and, through benefit, the state. Between sales and transfers, the position is stark. Local authorities in England owned 5 million homes in 1979 and own around 1.5 million now. Neither route was, on its own, the whole story. The one-for-one replacement promise deserves its own examination because it was the government's own answer to this criticism, and it failed for a specific, knowable reason. In 2012, the discounts were raised sharply, and the policy was accompanied by a commitment that every additional home sold would be replaced one for one. It sounded like a complete answer. It did not work, and the reason is arithmetic rather than bad faith. A council selling a house at a 70% discount receives 30% of its market value. Building a replacement costs 100% of a market value, often more since new build to modern standards is not cheap. Even where councils were permitted to retain receipts for replacement, they were being asked to fund a whole house with under a third of a house's worth of money, and to find the remainder from borrowing they were constrained in taking on, or from land they largely did not have. The replacement rate never approached 1 for 1. In several years, it was closer to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. The promise was not dishonest so much as innumerate. It could not have been met on the terms it was set. It is instructive to look at what other countries did with the same problem, because it shows the outcome was a choice rather than a law of nature. Vienna is the standard comparison. The city has built and retained social housing continuously since the 1920s, and today around 60% of Viennese live in housing that is either municipally owned or in limited profit associations. Crucially, the city has not sold it. Because the stock is large and permanent, it sets the price for the whole market. Private landlords in Vienna compete against an abundant, decent, secure alternative which holds private rents down for everyone, including people who do not live in social housing. The public money goes into building rather than into subsidizing rents. Singapore took the opposite route and reached a similar result by different means. The Housing and Development Board builds the great majority of Singaporean homes and sells them to citizens on 99-year leases. So Singapore does sell aggressively, and ownership is above 90%. But it never stops building. Resale is restricted by eligibility rules and minimum occupation periods, and the state retains the freehold and the land. Selling is coupled to replacement by design. Both models sustain themselves. Britain's did not, and the difference is not ideological. Singapore is more enthusiastic about home ownership than Britain has ever been. The difference is that in both Vienna and Singapore, the sale or the letting of a home is structurally tied to the construction of another one, and in Britain it was structurally severed from it. The policy has now been partially unwound, which tells you something about how the arithmetic looks to people who have to fund it. Scotland abolished the right to buy in 2016. Wales abolished it in 2019. Both nations concluded that the stock loss was doing more damage than the ownership gain was worth, and both made that decision under governments of different political colours to the one that introduced it. In England, the policy remains, though the terms have moved considerably. maximum discounts were cut sharply in 2024, and the qualifying period was lengthened. The direction of travel is toward restriction rather than expansion. It is also worth being fair about what the policy achieved, because a serious account has to include the gains. Around 2 million households own homes they would very likely not otherwise own. For many, that home is the only substantial asset the family holds, and it has passed to their children. The wealth effect of that on a particular cohort, broadly working-class households who were council tenants between roughly 1980 and 2000, was real and large. Home ownership in Britain rose from around 55% in 1979 to a peak near 71% in 2003. That is not nothing. It is one of the largest deliberate transfers of asset wealth to working-class households in British history. The difficulty is what happened to the cohort behind them. Home ownership has fallen back to around 65%, and among households aged 25 to 34, the fall is far steeper. The generation that would once have been housed by a council and might once have bought that council house now rents privately at a higher cost with no prospect of acquisition. The policy gave one cohort an asset by taking the option away from the next. Whether that is a success depends entirely on which cohort you are counting. So consider the counterfactual carefully, because it clarifies what the actual error was. Imagine the Housing Act 1980 exactly as passed, the right, the discounts, all of it, with one change. Councils retain 100% of receipts and are required to spend them on replacement social housing. In that world, 2 million tenants still become owners. The wealth transfer still happens, the politics still work. But the social housing stock does not fall, because every sale funds a build. There is no growing waiting list, no migration of low-income households into the private rented sector, and no £30 billion housing benefit bill inflated by private rents. The discount would still be at cost. You cannot replace a house at full price with a receipt worth half of it, so replacement would have required topping up from elsewhere. The stock would have shrunk somewhat, but nothing like from 5 million to 1.5. The catastrophic outcome did not come from selling. It came from selling and then being forbidden to rebuild. That is a Treasury decision about capital receipts, made for reasons of public borrowing control that had nothing to do with housing policy at all. It is not the part anyone argues about, and it is the part that did the damage. There is one more effect, and it may be the most consequential of all, because it changed what the words council housing mean in Britain. Right to Buy did not sell a random sample of the stock. Tenants bought what was worth buying. A 3-bedroom house with a garden on a well-regarded estate sold readily. It was a good home, it would hold value, and a bank would lend against it. A 1-bedroom flat on the 11th floor of a system-built tower with a communal heating charge and a leasehold service bill did not sell, because it was not a good asset and lenders knew it. So, the sales concentrated overwhelmingly in houses rather than flats, in better estates rather than worse, and in areas with strong property markets rather than weak ones. What remained in council ownership was, systematically, the least desirable part of what had been a broad and mixed stock. This is adverse selection, and it is the same mechanism that undoes an insurance pool when the healthy members leave. The average quality of what is left falls not because anything happened to it, but because everything better was removed. The social consequence followed within a generation. In 1979, a council house was ordinary. A nurse, a foreman, a bus driver lived in one, in a house on a street of similar houses. By 2005, the surviving social stock was disproportionately flats, disproportionately on estates that had lost their best properties and most settled residents, and allocated increasingly by acute need rather than by waiting list position, because scarcity forces rationing by desperation. Council housing became residual. That word does real work. It means housing for people with no alternative, rather than housing that anybody might reasonably live in. The stigma that attaches to it in Britain, and which does not attach to social housing in Vienna or Singapore, is largely a product of that transformation. None of it was announced. Nobody legislated to concentrate poverty in the worst part of the stock. It is simply what happens when you allow selective purchase from a mixed portfolio and prevent replacement. And for the tenants who did buy flats, there was a trap in the paperwork that almost nobody understood at the time. A house is bought freehold, a flat is bought leasehold, and the freeholder remains the council. That means the buyer owns the inside of the flat and a long lease on it, while the council retains the structure, the roof, the lifts, the walkways, and the grounds, and retains the right to bill leaseholders for a share of any major works to them. For years, that produced modest service charges and few complaints. Then the blocks aged. A roof needs replacing, a heating system fails, a tower needs new windows or, after 2017, new cladding. The council carries out the work and apportions the cost among the flats. A leaseholder who bought for £8,000 in 1986 receives a bill for 30, 40, in some documented cases over £100,000. There is no realistic way to refuse. The obligation is in the lease, signed at purchase. Councils can offer payment plans and in some cases equity loans, but the debt is real and it is secured against the flat. Households have sold at a loss or found their flat unsellable because no buyer will take on a known forthcoming bill. Southwark, Camden, Lambeth, Tower Hamlets. The same pattern recurs wherever there are large post-war blocks with a mix of tenants and leaseholders. It is not a scandal in the sense of anyone acting improperly. The councils are recovering costs they are legally entitled to recover on works the buildings genuinely, but it means the extraordinarily good deal was not uniform. For a family who bought a house with a garden, it was exactly as good as it looked. For a family who bought a flat in a tower, the discount could be entirely consumed decades later by a bill they had no way to anticipate and no ability to decline. Adverse selection, in other words, was not only a problem for the stock the council kept, it was a problem for some of the people who bought. The regional pattern compounded it. Sales ran highest where property was most attractive and incomes highest. The southeast, the home counties, the more prosperous parts of the Midlands. Those are precisely the areas where housing pressure is now most severe and where a council today has the least to add. The stock survived best in the places with the weakest markets, which are the places with the least demand for it. The policy therefore removed social housing most thoroughly from the areas that would come to need it most. And the downstream costs are visible in a line item that barely existed in 1980. When a council cannot house a homeless family, it has a statutory duty to accommodate them anyway. With no stock, that means temporary accommodation. bed and breakfast, hostels, nightly, let private flats, bought at short notice at commercial rates from private providers. English councils now spend well over £2 billion a year on temporary accommodation. More than 120,000 households containing over 150,000 children are living in it. Some have been for years. It is the most expensive and least satisfactory way to house anybody. It costs more per week than a social tenancy, provides no security, and frequently sits outside the borough that placed the family. Councils are, in effect, renting emergency accommodation on the spot market because they sold the assets that would have let them plan. That figure, £2 billion a year rising, is a direct operating cost of not owning enough homes. It does not appear anywhere in the accounting of Right to Buy because it lands in a different budget, in a different decade, under a different heading. Now, the general mechanism, because this is what makes the episode worth more than a housing story. The pattern is this. An institution sells an asset that produces recurring income, books the one-off receipt as a gain, and does not account for the recurring cost it has just created. It appears constantly. A council sells a car park to a developer, books the receipt, and then pays to lease parking. A government sells student loan books at a discount to face value, books the proceeds, and forgoes decades of repayments. A company sells its freehold offices and leases them back, improving this year's balance sheet while committing to rent for 25 years. A hospital trust builds under a private finance initiative, keeps the construction cost off its books, and pays a service charge until the 2040s. In every case, the accounting is legal and the arithmetic is unfavorable, and the reason it happens is that the receipt lands in 1 year and the cost lands in the person taking the decision is measured on the year. The cost belongs to a successor. Right to Buy is the largest and clearest British example of this shape, which is why it is worth understanding as an accounting story rather than only a political one. The politics tell you why it was popular. The accounting tells you why it did not work. And the tell in every case is the same question, which is rarely asked at the moment of sale. Not, what is this asset worth? That is the easy question, and there is always a valuer willing to answer it. The question is, what will we have to buy back, and for how long once this is gone? For 2 million council houses, the answer turned out to be the same houses from the people who now own them at a higher price forever. Britain did not sell its social housing. It sold the income from it, kept the obligation, and agreed to buy the service back on the open market for as long as the need lasts. The need has not ended, and on present policy, it does not end. That is not a housing decision. It is a balance sheet, and it is still open.